Gideon Marsh was a ghost, and he liked it that way. For 3 years, the only souls who knew he was alive were the 3 cows in his pasture and the horse in his barn. He'd carved out a life on a forgotten scrap of land, a place where the past couldn't find him. He'd buried his name, buried his memories, and buried the man he used to be. The silence was his only friend, and the swing of his axe was the only conversation he needed. So when he heard the footsteps, he froze. It wasn't one person. It was a slow, steady procession. The crunch of boots on the dry dirt of his path, coming closer and closer. He raised his head, the axe still held tight in his calloused hands, and his blood ran cold. 7 women. They were walking up his path like they owned the place. Their dresses were worn, their faces smudged with the dust of a long journey, but their eyes were sharp as newly forged steel. They walked in a silent, determined formation, a flock of tired crows with a singular, unnerving purpose. The woman in the lead was tall, with auburn hair pulled back so tight it seemed to pull at the corners of her eyes. She didn't slow down, didn't hesitate. She walked right up to the edge of his wood-chopping block, looked him square in the face, and said something that shattered the silence of his world. "We're here to milk your cows." Gideon just stood there, axe held high, a statue of disbelief. These weren't lost travelers. They weren't asking for help. They were stating a fact. Before he could even form a word, they fanned out across his yard, moving with a strange, practiced familiarity. One woman, her hair streaked with silver, moved with a slight limp toward the water pump. Another, barely a girl of 16, clutched a milking pail so hard her knuckles were bone white. They all looked at him, but not like you look at a stranger. They looked at him like he was a landmark they'd been expecting to find at the end of a long, hard road. His voice, when it finally came, was a rusty thing, unused to forming words for other people. "Ma'am, I don't know what you think you're doing, but this is private property." The auburn-haired leader didn't even flinch. She just tilted her head, her gaze shifting to the barn where his 3 cows, Bessie, Daisy, and Buttercup, were swishing their tails in the afternoon sun. "Those animals need milking twice a day," she said, her voice calm and steady. "From the looks of their udders, you've been letting them suffer." She wasn't wrong. He was a terrible milker. His hands were too big, too clumsy. The cows had been getting agitated, their milk coming in less and less. It was a chore he hated, a constant reminder of his own inadequacy in this new life. But hearing it from her, from this stranger, felt like an accusation. An older woman with hands as worn as old leather stepped toward the young girl and took the pail from her. "We know what we're doing," she said, her voice raspy but firm. "Been doing it our whole lives." There was something in the way she said it, a faint echo of a voice he hadn't heard in years, that made a knot tighten in his chest. He wanted to scream at them, to tell them to leave, to let him return to the quiet, lonely peace he'd fought so hard to build. He wanted his solitude back, but as he watched them march toward his barn, something held him back. It was the way the young girl, Mercy, glanced back at him, her eyes wide with a fear that looked so familiar, so achingly familiar. It was the stubborn set of the leader's jaw, a mirror image of the one he saw in his shaving mirror every morning. "Hold on," he called out, his voice stronger this time, echoing across the yard. The women stopped. They turned as one, their expressions a mixture of patience and annoyance. "Nobody touches my animals," Gideon said, lowering the axe slowly. "Not until you tell me who you are, and what you really want." The tall woman with the auburn hair just smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a smile that held a secret, a smile that knew something he didn't, a smile that was about to take a match to his carefully constructed world and burn it to the ground. "My name is Clarabelle," she said, her voice as steady as a rock. "And these women, they're family." She gestured to the group behind her, each one now staring at him with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. She took a step closer, her smile gone, replaced by something far more serious. "Your family, Gideon." The axe fell from his hand. It hit the dirt with a heavy, dull thud that seemed to suck all the sound from the world. Family. The word wasn't a word. It was a punch to the gut. It was a ghost story whispered in the dead of night. He had walked away from family. He had burned every bridge, cut every tie, and salted the earth behind him. He'd left because some wounds don't heal. They just fester. That's That's impossible, he stammered, his mind reeling. But even as he denied it, he was seeing it. He was seeing the truth in their faces. Clarabelle's stubborn chin was a perfect match for his own. The nervous way the youngest girl shifted her weight from foot to foot was the exact same habit his little sister Sarah used to have. The deep brown eyes passed down through his bloodline like a brand. It was all there. Clarabelle took another step, closing the distance between them. She lifted a hand and traced a faint, silvery line that ran from her left temple down her cheek, a scar he knew all too well. "You remember this?" she asked, her voice softer now, but carrying a weight of years. "From when you pushed me out of the hayloft. I was 12. You said I was too little to play with the big kids." The memory hit him like a physical blow. A hot summer day, the smell of hay, little Clara, his cousin, his mother's sister's daughter, always trailing behind him, wanting to be part of everything. He'd been angry, a moody teenager wanting to be left alone. He'd pushed her, not hard, but she'd stumbled backward, tripping over a loose board and falling 15 feet to the hard-packed earth below. The screaming, he could still hear the screaming. "Clara," he whispered, the name feeling like a foreign object in his mouth. "But how? How did you find me? Why are you even here?" The woman with the silver-streaked hair and the limp stepped forward. "We found you because we had to, Gideon, and we're here because—" She trailed off, looking to Clarabelle for permission. Clarabelle just shook her head and started walking toward the barn again. "We'll explain everything, but these animals need to be tended to. It's been a long time since they were handled properly." She glanced back over her shoulder, a flicker of the little girl he once knew in her eyes. "You can listen while we work, unless you'd rather your cows suffer while we talk about the past." He was trapped. He couldn't let them touch his animals, but he couldn't let them leave without answers. He found himself following them, his feet moving as if on their own, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and dawning horror. The youngest girl, could that be Mercy, Sarah's daughter? She'd have been just a toddler when he left. And the woman with the limp, Aunt Viola, his father's estranged sister? He felt like a man seeing ghosts in broad daylight. As they reached the barn door, Clarabelle turned to face him one last time, her expression grim. "Fair warning, cousin," she said, her voice low. "What we have to tell you, it's not easy, but you need to know why we're really here." The way she said it sent a shiver down his spine. It was the same tone she'd used as a kid right before confessing she'd broken their grandmother's favorite vase. It was a tone that promised bad news. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the smell of hay and animals. The women moved with a quiet, powerful efficiency that made Gideon feel like an intruder in his own life. Clarabelle walked straight to Bessie, his most temperamental cow, the one who'd kicked him more times than he could count. But under Clarabelle's calm, knowing hands, Bessie stood as still as a statue. The gentle, rhythmic sound of milk hitting the bottom of the pail began to fill the silence. "Your sister Sarah is dead, Gideon." Clarabelle didn't look at him. She just kept milking, her voice flat, matter of fact. The kind of voice you use when the truth is so terrible, there's no gentle way to say it. "Fever took her, last winter." The words didn't register at first. They were just sounds. But then they sank in, sharp and cold and final. Sarah, his baby sister. The one person in the world who had always taken his side, even when he was wrong. The one who had stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face, begging him not to go. And he'd ridden away without even looking back. The pinging of milk into the pail was the only sound in the universe. It was the sound of his heart breaking. The woman with the silver hair, Aunt Viola it had to be, spoke from beside the second cow. "Before she died, she made us promise something. She made us swear on her life that we'd find you." She nodded toward the girl standing by the door, the girl who still hadn't spoken a word, who was clutching her own pail like a shield. "She made us swear we'd tell you about Mercy." Gideon finally forced himself to look at the girl. Really look. And it was like seeing a ghost. Those were Sarah's eyes, Sarah's chin, Sarah's way of jutting out her hip when she was scared, but trying her best not to show it. His knees felt weak. He had to brace himself against a wooden post to keep from falling. That's Sarah's daughter, Clarabelle confirmed, finally meeting his gaze. Your niece, 15 years old. Been working herself to the bone trying to keep food on the table since her mama passed. She paused, the milking sound stopping. The silence was heavy, suffocating. The farm is gone, Gideon. Had to sell it to pay for the medicine. Her voice cracked just a little. Not that it did any good in the end. The girl, Mercy, finally spoke. Her voice was a small, fragile thing, barely a whisper. Mama. Mama talked about you. Every single day. She said you were the best man she knew. Even if you were too stubborn to see it yourself. Tears were tracing clean paths through the dust on her cheeks now. She said you left because you were hurting, not because you stopped loving us. Something inside Gideon's chest, something he thought had turned to stone 3 years ago, cracked open. The walls he'd built around his heart, stone by painful stone, crumbled into dust. He'd left because of a fight, a terrible, unforgivable fight with his father. Words had been said that could never be unsaid. He'd seen the family tearing itself apart, and he'd run. He hadn't been strong enough to stay and fight. He'd just run, and Sarah had paid the price for his cowardice. Where have you all been living? He managed to ask, his voice thick with a grief so fresh it felt like a physical wound. Here and there, said another one of the women, her face hard and weary. Bouncing from one cousin's floor to another, wearing out welcomes. Mercy's been passed around like a bad penny. The rest of us, we've been getting by. Barely. Clarabelle stood up, her pail full. She wiped her hands on her apron, her eyes locking onto his. That's why we're here, Gideon. We're not asking to milk your cows. We're not asking for a handout. She took a deep breath. We're asking if there's room in your life for family again, because we have nowhere else to go. He opened his mouth to answer, to say yes, to say anything. But before a sound could escape his lips, another sound cut through the air, a sound that didn't belong in his quiet, isolated world. The thunder of approaching horses, fast, too fast. Clarabelle's face went white as a sheet. Her eyes darted to the barn door, wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the past and everything to do with the immediate, terrifying present. Get away from the door, she hissed, her voice a raw whisper of panic. Everyone, get back. Now! But it was too late. 3 riders crested the hill, their dark silhouettes framed against the setting sun. They weren't travelers. They were hunters. Gideon could see it in the way they sat their horses, in the way their hands rested casually, confidently, on the guns at their hips. The man in the lead was a mountain, a bear of a man with a thick, dark beard and eyes that looked like chips of ice. He pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of the yard, his cold gaze sweeping over the farm, over the barn, like a predator assessing its territory. Aunt Viola let out a small, choked sound. Tobias Kane, she whispered, her voice trembling. He's been tracking us for 2 days. Gideon felt a cold dread settle deep in his bones. He knew that name. Everyone in the territory knew that name. Kane was a vulture who circled failing farms and desperate families, a man who collected debts with interest paid in pain and blood. He owned businesses, he owned land, and it was said he owned the local law. What does a man like Kane want with you? Gideon asked, his voice low and dangerous. It was Mercy who answered, her small voice cracking under the weight of her words. Mama, she owed him money for the medicine. She looked up at him, and the look in her eyes was ancient, filled with a sorrow no 15-year-old should ever know. When she died, he said the debt passed to family, to us. The horses were closer now, their hoofbeats a steady, menacing drumbeat, counting down to disaster. Clarabelle peered through a crack in the barn door, her body rigid with fear. He wants us to work off the debt, she said, spitting the words like poison. In his saloons, in his hotels. She didn't have to finish the sentence. The implication hung in the air, thick and foul. A feeling Gideon hadn't felt in 3 long years began to uncoil in his chest. A cold, black rage. He'd walked away from violence. He'd sworn off the anger that had nearly destroyed his life once before. But watching his niece, his family, tremble in fear as this monster rode onto his land, it woke something up, something primal. How much? He growled, already moving toward the back wall of the barn, toward the place where he kept his rifle. $300, Clarabelle said, plus interest. It grows every day we run. $300. It might as well have been 3 million. He didn't have a tenth of that. He'd traded his old life for solitude, not for wealth. Outside, a voice boomed across the yard, a voice dripping with false, syrupy politeness. Gideon Marsh, I do believe you have some property of mine in that barn. I've come to collect. Property. He'd called them property. Gideon's hands closed around the cool wood and steel of his rifle. Muscle memory took over. He checked the load, his movements swift and sure. But as he turned toward the door, Clarabelle grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. Don't, she pleaded, her eyes wide with desperation. He has 2 men with him. They're hired guns, Gideon, the fastest in the territory. You try to fight them, and you'll just get us all killed. This is my land, he snarled, the rage making his vision swim. You're my family. He's not taking anyone. Uncle Gideon! Mercy's quiet voice cut through his anger. Mama, she made me promise something else too. She said if we ever found you, I wasn't to let you throw your life away for us. She said you'd already lost enough. Outside, Kane was losing his patience. I'm counting to 10, Marsh. Then I'm coming in. 1, 2. Gideon looked at the terrified faces around him. These women, these ghosts from his past, had walked back into his life only to lead a monster to his door. He felt a surge of despair, of helplessness. But then he looked at Mercy's face, so much like Sarah's, and the despair burned away, leaving only cold, hard resolve. He had run once before. He would not run again. 8, 9. Kane's voice was a death sentence. Gideon raised the rifle, ready to step out and meet his fate. But Clarabelle blocked his path again, her face pale, her eyes wild. Wait, there's something else. Something you don't know, she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. About why Sarah really died. Why she owed Kane the money. Gideon froze, his finger hovering over the trigger. What are you talking about? Mercy was sobbing now, her small body shaking. The medicine, it wasn't for a fever, she choked out. Mama got sick because someone poisoned our well. 10! The word was a roar, and it was followed by the splintering crack of wood as Kane's heavy boots smashed the barn door off its hinges. The doorway was filled with his shadow. Tobias Kane stepped into the barn like a walking storm, his 2 hired guns fanning out on either side of him, their hands hovering over their holsters. Up close, he was even bigger, a brute of a man with knuckles scarred from a lifetime of violence. His eyes, cold and dead as a snake's, swept across the women, lingering on Mercy for a moment too long. Well, the whole flock, all in one place, saves me the trouble of hunting you down one by one. His gaze finally landed on Gideon. Gideon Marsh, I heard you'd gone soft, hiding out here talking to cows. But harboring stolen property, that's a serious crime. They're not property, Gideon said, his voice a low growl. He kept the rifle leveled at Kane's chest, but the 2 gunslingers were watching him, their fingers twitching. It was a standoff he couldn't win. Kane chuckled, a sound like rocks grinding together. Family that owes me $300, which, with the interest for my trouble, we'll call $350, their property. He took a step forward, completely unafraid of the rifle. But I'm a man of business. You pay me what you owe right now, and they can stay. Otherwise, they come with me. And if I refuse, then I take them anyway, Kane said, his smile turning cruel. And my men here will bury you in a shallow grave right behind this barn. Your choice, hermit. But before Gideon could respond, Clarabelle stepped forward, her fear replaced by a fiery defiance. Tell him the rest, Tobias, she challenged, her voice ringing through the barn. Tell him why you really poisoned that well. Kane's smile vanished. A flicker of something dark and dangerous crossed his face. Careful, girl. Some secrets are best kept buried. You wanted Sarah's land, Clarabelle pressed on, her voice getting stronger. Everyone knew there was silver in those hills, so you poisoned the well. You made her and half the families on that ridge sick, and then you came around, playing the savior, offering to buy their land for pennies on the dollar so they could afford the medicine you were selling at an inflated price. The pieces slammed together in Gideon's mind, forming a picture of pure, calculated evil. You you killed my sister for a piece of dirt. Business is business, Kane sneered, shrugging. Your sister was stubborn. She refused my generous offer. His eyes slid back to Mercy, a lecherous glint in them. Don't you worry. I'll take real good care of her. Teach her how a smart girl ought to behave. That was it. That was the line. The rage that had been simmering inside Gideon for 3 years. The grief for his sister, the guilt for his absence, it all exploded in a single white-hot flash. He was no longer thinking. He was just reacting. A predator protecting his own. He tightened his grip on the rifle, his finger squeezing the trigger. But he wasn't fast enough. One of Kane's men was a blur of motion. The crack of his pistol was deafening in the enclosed space. The world seemed to slow down. Gideon braced for the impact, for the searing pain. But it never came. It wasn't Gideon who fell. It was the gunman. He cried out, a sharp yelp of pain, dropping his pistol as he clutched a hand that was suddenly gushing blood. And standing behind him, half hidden in the shadows, was Aunt Viola. In her hand, she held a tiny smoking derringer that had appeared from nowhere. Always carry insurance, she said, her voice grim and steady. Learn that lesson the hard way. Kane spun around, his face contorted with fury. You crazy old witch. You just signed your own death warrant. But that single moment of distraction was all Gideon needed. He didn't shoot. Shooting was too clean, too quick. He reversed the rifle, swinging the heavy wooden stock in a brutal arc. It connected with the side of Kane's jaw with a sickening crack. The big man staggered back, stunned, hitting the barn wall hard. The second gunman, seeing his boss go down, reached for his own weapon. But Clarabelle was already there. She swung the heavy milk-filled pail with all her might. It crashed against the side of the gunman's head, and he crumpled to the floor without a sound, out cold. The barn was suddenly, shockingly quiet. Kane slowly pushed himself upright, wiping a smear of blood from his split lip. He looked at Gideon, and for the first time, there was a glimmer of respect in his cold eyes. Well, I'll be. The hermit still has some bite. He held his hands up, showing they were empty. This changes nothing, Marsh. You got lucky, but you can't fight my whole organization. You can't fight the whole territory. I don't have to fight the whole territory, Gideon said, bringing the rifle back around, the barrel now aimed squarely between Kane's eyes. I just have to fight you. Kane's mind was already working, calculating the odds. He was a cornered rat, but a dangerous one. Kill me and my partners will burn this place to the ground with everyone in it. They'll hunt your family to the ends of the earth. Let me walk away, and maybe we can come to an arrangement. An arrangement? Gideon's voice was deadly quiet. You murdered my sister. I created a business opportunity, Kane corrected him, unrepentant. She made a poor choice. He was trying to regain control, to turn this back into a negotiation. Think about the future, Marsh. Their future. He nodded toward Mercy and the other women. Mercy, however, stepped forward, her small face set with a resolve that mirrored her mother's. He won't stop, Uncle Gideon. Men like him, they never stop. Not until they get what they want or someone stops them for good. Kane's eyes narrowed. Smart girl. A shame she's about to learn some very hard lessons about how the world really works. The threat was unmistakable. Gideon's finger tightened on the trigger again. This time he wouldn't hesitate, but Clarabelle put a hand on his arm, her touch surprisingly gentle. There's another way, she said, her voice low and urgent. Something Sarah told me, right before the end, about some papers she hid. Kane's mask of confidence flickered. For just a second, Gideon saw a flash of genuine fear in the man's eyes. Your sister was always too clever for her own good, he snarled, but the swagger was gone from his voice. Even if she did hide something, who's going to believe the word of a dead woman and a gaggle of broke, desperate females? Aunt Viola answered, Her derringer still held steady. The territorial marshal might, especially when those papers prove how you've been buying up land with forged deeds for the last 5 years. That hit a nerve. Kane went pale. And that's not all, Clarabelle added, pressing her advantage. The papers show which wells you poisoned. They name the families who died. They document everything, Tobias. Everything. Kane was a trapped animal. He looked from the rifle in Gideon's hands to the derringer in Viola's, his mind racing. He was a businessman, a gambler. He knew when to fold a losing hand. All right, he finally spat. Let's say these papers exist. Let's say you could make some trouble. What do you want? Clarabelle didn't hesitate. She stepped up beside Gideon, their family united against a common enemy. The debt is gone. All of it. You sign a paper saying it's paid in full, and you leave this territory. You ride out and you never ever come back. And if I don't, Kane sneered, a last vestige of defiance. Gideon raised the rifle just an inch, the message clear. Then we see just how much lead a man like you can hold. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sounds were the ragged breathing of the men on the floor and the nervous shifting of the cows. Then slowly, Kane began to back away. He pulled his 2 men, one bleeding, one groggy, toward the broken doorway. He gave Gideon one last look, a look of pure, venomous hatred. This isn't over, Marsh, he hissed. You think you've won? All you've done is buy yourself a little more time, and I promise you, you're going to regret it. And then they were gone. The sound of their retreating horses faded into the twilight, leaving a ringing silence behind them. Gideon felt his whole body start to shake, the adrenaline draining away, leaving him weak and trembling. He leaned the rifle against the wall, his legs feeling like they might give out. The barn no longer felt like his. It felt like theirs, a place where his family, broken and scattered for so long, had come together to make a stand. He turned to Clarabelle, his mind still trying to process everything. The papers, he said, his voice hoarse. Sarah's papers? Are they real? Clarabelle met his gaze, and for the first time, she gave him a genuine smile. It transformed her face, softening the hard lines of worry and grief. She reached into a hidden pocket in her dress and pulled out a small, oilcloth-wrapped bundle. As real as the sunset, she said, her voice thick with pride. Your sister was the smartest person I ever knew. She figured out Kane's whole scheme. She spent months gathering proof, forged deeds, witness statements, even a list of the officials he was bribing. It's all in here. Mercy came closer, her eyes wide as she looked at the bundle. Mama, she never told me. She was protecting you, child, Aunt Viola said, finally tucking her derringer away. She knew that if Kane ever found out what she had, he'd come after anyone who might know where it was hidden. He'd come after you. Gideon felt a fresh wave of grief, but this time it was mixed with a fierce, burning pride. Even as she was dying, Sarah had been fighting. She'd been laying the groundwork for a justice she would never live to see. She hadn't just left behind a daughter, she'd left behind a weapon. So, what now? He asked, looking around at the 7 women who had turned his world upside down in the space of an hour. Now we live, Clarabelle said, her voice filled with a simple, profound determination. We milk the cows. We fix that door. We tend this land. And we build something new. Together. The question came out before he could stop it, laced with a hope he hadn't felt in years. All of you? You want to stay here? Mercy stepped forward and, for the first time, she reached out and took his hand. Her hand was small, but her grip was firm, just like her mother's. If you'll have us, Uncle Gideon, she said, we've been scattered for too long. It feels good to finally have a place to belong. Over the next few hours as they worked together, securing the barn, tending to the animals, talking in low, quiet voices, the empty spaces in Gideon's life began to fill up. He learned their stories, how Clarabelle had been a seamstress in a dusty town, barely earning enough to eat. How Aunt Viola had been a companion to a cruel old rancher who died and left her penniless. How each of them had been drifting, alone, carrying their own private sorrows. They were all broken, in their own ways. But here, together, the broken pieces seemed to fit. Later that evening, as they walked back to his small, lonely cabin, Gideon realized it wasn't his cabin anymore. It was their house. The sound of their voices, the scent of wood smoke from the chimney as they prepared to cook a real meal, felt more like home than anything he'd known in 3 years. The silence he had once cherished now felt like a sickness he was finally recovering from. As they stepped onto the porch, Clarabelle paused, her face serious in the fading light. "You know he'll be back," she said quietly. "Cain, men like that don't forgive, and they never forget." Gideon looked past her, watching as Mercy gently stroked the nose of his horse, a natural, fearless connection with the animal that was so purely a part of their family's blood. He thought of Sarah. He thought of the promise these women had fulfilled. He thought of the rifle still leaning by the door and the oilcloth packet tucked safely away. "Let him come," Gideon said, and his voice held a strength he didn't know he still possessed. "He won't find a hermit living here next time. He'll find a family, and we'll be ready for him." But what Gideon didn't know, what none of them could possibly know, was that Tobias Cain wasn't just a man. He was a symptom of a much deeper disease. The papers Sarah had collected were not just a weapon against one greedy man. They were a key that could unlock a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of power in the territory. Cain's threat wasn't just the angry words of a defeated bully. It was a promise. And the war for their survival had only just begun. The fight in the barn wasn't the end. It was just the first shot. The next few days were a strange dream. Gideon's quiet, solitary routine was shattered, replaced by a constant hum of activity. The small cabin, once so empty and silent, was now filled with the sounds of life. Women's voices humming old tunes, the scent of baking bread, the quiet murmur of conversation late into the night. It was overwhelming, and for the first time in years, Gideon felt something other than guilt and loneliness. He felt needed. He learned their names. There was Elspeth, a stern, quiet woman who had been a school teacher before her school was mysteriously burned down after she refused to sell her land to one of Cain's associates. There was Maeve and her sister Deirdre, who had been working in one of Cain's laundries, little more than indentured servants. And there was Lyra, a young woman with haunted eyes who never spoke about her past. 7 women, 7 different stories of loss and hardship, all tied together by blood and a shared enemy. Aunt Viola quickly became the group's quiet pillar of strength. One afternoon, Gideon found her sharpening a set of kitchen knives with a frightening intensity. "A dull blade is more dangerous than a sharp one," she said without looking up. "It makes you clumsy. Same goes for people. Cain thinks we're dull. He thinks we're weak. We have to prove him wrong." It was on the 4th day that the first sign of trouble appeared. Gideon had ridden into the nearby town of Redemption for supplies, a place he'd avoided for 3 years. The town was small, dusty, and had a feeling of fear hanging over it like a shroud. As he was loading sacks of flour into his wagon, the town sheriff, a man with a drooping mustache and shifty eyes named Barlow, approached him. "Heard you had some visitors out at your place, Marsh," Barlow said, his tone casual, but his eyes were not. "Just some family I haven't seen in a while," Gideon replied, keeping his voice even. "Family," Barlow mused, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Gideon's boot. "Funny thing, Tobias Cain was in here yesterday. Seemed real interested in your family. Said they owed him a considerable sum of money." "That's a private matter," Gideon said, turning his back to continue loading his supplies. Barlow took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper. "In this town, Mr. Cain's business is my business. He wants those women. He says they belong to him. I'd advise you to remember who runs things around here and hand them over. It would be healthier for everyone involved." Gideon stopped what he was doing and turned to face the sheriff. He looked him dead in the eye. "You tell Cain that my family is under my protection, and you tell him if he, or any of his hired lackeys, set one foot on my property again, I'll consider it trespassing, and I deal with trespassers myself." Barlow's face hardened. "That's a mighty big mistake, Marsh. Mighty big." He turned and walked away, leaving Gideon with the cold certainty that the law in this town would offer them no protection. They were well and truly on their own. When he returned to the farm and told them what had happened, a grim silence fell over the group. It was Clarabelle who broke it. "He's testing us," she said, her hands clenched into fists. "He's trying to scare us into running. He's using the law to isolate us." "So what do we do?" Mercy asked, her voice small. Gideon looked at the faces around him. He saw fear, yes, but he also saw something else. A stubborn, defiant spark. The same spark he'd seen in Sarah. The same spark he felt igniting in his own soul. "We don't run," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even himself. "We prepare. This is our home. We're going to defend it." The next morning, Gideon took them to a small hidden canyon behind the farm. He pulled out 2 old rifles and a pistol he'd kept stored away. "Everyone is going to learn how to use one of these," he announced. The women, except for Viola, who already seemed proficient with her derringer, were hesitant. Elspeth, the former schoolteacher, looked at the rifle as if it were a venomous snake. I can't." "You can, and you will," Gideon said, his tone firm but patient. "Shooting isn't about liking it. It's about surviving. It's about making sure that if Cain's men come back, you have a choice other than begging for mercy they won't give you." He spent the rest of the day teaching them how to load, how to aim, how to control their breathing. It was slow, frustrating work, but as the day wore on, he saw a change. Their fear began to be replaced by a grim determination. The crack of the rifle shots echoing through the canyon sounded less like violence and more like defiance. It was the sound of victims refusing to be victims any longer. That night, as they sat around the fire, poring over Sarah's papers by lamplight, Clarabelle made a discovery. "Gideon, look at this," she said, her finger tracing a line on a crudely drawn map that was tucked in with the forged deeds. "This isn't a land deed. It looks like a layout of a mine." Gideon leaned closer. The map showed a series of tunnels under the very land Cain had stolen from his sister and the other families. But there was something else. A set of notes in Sarah's familiar handwriting in the margins. "The west tunnel is unstable," Clarabelle read aloud. "Father always said it was prone to collapse. Cain is using it for storage. Main support beam is cracked." A memory surfaced in Gideon's mind, a conversation from his childhood. His father, a man who knew every rock and ravine in these hills, warning him to stay away from the old silver mines. "They're a death trap," he'd said. "One good shake, and the whole mountain will come down on itself." Sarah had known. She hadn't just collected evidence of Cain's crimes. She had found his weakness. His entire operation, his wealth, his power, was based on a mind that was structurally unsound. He was sitting on a powder keg, and Sarah had left them the match. But before they could even begin to formulate a plan, their time ran out. A lookout Lyra had insisted on setting up on the ridge came running back to the cabin, her face pale with terror. "Riders!" she gasped, pointing toward the valley. "At least a dozen of them. And they're not trying to be quiet." Gideon grabbed his rifle and ran to the porch. In the distance, under the cold light of the moon, he could see a line of torches snaking its way toward them. It wasn't a warning this time. It was an army. Cain had decided to end this, once and for all. "Inside now!" Gideon yelled. "Barricade the doors and windows. Get your weapons. Do exactly as we practiced." The calm, quiet homestead transformed into a fortress. The women moved with a desperate, focused energy. Sacks of flour were piled against the doors. The heavy wooden table was shoved against the main window. In the dim lamplight, Gideon could see their faces, tight with fear, but also with a hard, unyielding resolve. He looked at Mercy, who was holding a small pistol with both hands, her knuckles white. She looked terrified, but she didn't run. She stood her ground. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, a relentless, terrifying drumbeat. They surrounded the cabin, the torchlight flickering through the cracks in the walls, casting dancing, monstrous shadows inside. Then Cain's voice boomed from the darkness. "Marsh, I gave you a chance to be reasonable. Now I'm just going to burn you out. I want the women, and I want those papers. Send them out, and I might let you live." Gideon walked to the window, peering through a small gap in the barricade. He could see at least 15 men, all armed, all looking eager for violence. His heart pounded in his chest. The odds were impossible. This was a suicide mission. He looked back at his family, huddled in the darkness, their faces illuminated by the single flickering lamp. This was it. This was the end of the line. He had left them once to save himself. Now he would stay with them, even if it meant dying together. "There's no deal, Kane," he shouted back, his voice raw with defiance. Kane laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. "Wrong answer, hermit," he gave an order. "Light it up." A flaming torch sailed through the air in a perfect arc, landing on the dry roof of the barn. In seconds, the whole structure was engulfed in flames. The fire lit up the yard like a hellish dawn. They were burning his home, his life, right in front of him. But it wasn't just the barn. More torches flew through the air, thudding against the walls of the cabin. The smell of smoke began to fill the small space. Then the shooting started. Bullets ripped through the thin wooden walls, sending splinters flying. One of the women screamed as a bullet grazed her arm. The siege had begun. "Stay down!" Gideon yelled, firing his own rifle through the window, the sound deafening inside the cabin. He saw one of Kane's men fall, but there were too many. For every one he might hit, a dozen more were firing back. They were trapped, pinned down. The fire was spreading, the smoke was getting thicker, and their time was running out. Kane wasn't just going to kill them. He was going to wipe them from the face of the earth, erasing them and their secrets in a blaze of fire and lead. As the flames licked higher and the air grew thick with smoke, Gideon knew that a straightforward fight was impossible. They would be cooked alive or shot to pieces within the hour. Hope was a dying ember. But then he looked at the map, still clutched in Clarabelle's hand, illuminated by the hellish orange glow from outside. Sarah's map, the mine, the unstable tunnel. An idea, desperate and insane, began to form in his mind. It was a long shot, a suicidal gamble. But it was the only shot they had. "Viola, Clarabelle, keep them pinned down on this side," he yelled over the gunfire. "Buy me 5 minutes." He turned to the other women. "The back window. We have to get out. There's a root cellar door on the north side of the house. We have to get to it." It was chaos. Bullets tore through the walls. The heat from the fire was becoming unbearable. Gideon smashed the back window with his rifle butt and helped the women climb out, one by one, into the relative darkness on the far side of the cabin. Mercy was trembling, but she moved with a grim purpose, clutching the oilcloth packet of papers. The root cellar was small, damp, and smelled of earth. It offered temporary safety, but it was also a tomb. They were trapped underground while Kane's men burned their world down around them. "What now, Gideon?" Clarabelle whispered, her face smudged with soot. "We're just delaying the inevitable." "No," Gideon said, his mind racing. He unrolled the map. "Sarah gave us the answer. We're not going to win by defending. We have to attack." He pointed to a section of the map. "This tunnel, the unstable one she marked. It runs almost directly under Kane's main office at the mine headquarters. It's a mile from here, over the ridge. If we can get there, if we can get inside that tunnel—" "It's a suicide mission," Viola stated, reloading her Derringer with steady hands. "Kane will have guards posted everywhere." "They're all here right now," Gideon countered, a wild light in his eyes. "He brought his whole army to crush us. He's left his kingdom unguarded." It was a desperate gamble, built on layers of hope and uncertainty. Could they even get there without being seen? Could they find the entrance to the tunnel? And what could they possibly do, even if they did? "What's the plan, Uncle Gideon?" Mercy asked, her voice quiet but steady. She was holding the papers, her inheritance of truth and danger. Gideon looked at her, at the trust in her eyes, and he knew he couldn't fail. He couldn't let Sarah's sacrifice be for nothing. "You and the others are going to create a diversion," he said to Clarabelle. "Follow the creek bed east. Once you're far enough away, start making noise. A few gunshots. Anything to make Kane think we've broken through his line and are trying to escape that way. It'll draw some of his men off." "And you?" Clarabelle asked. "I'm going over the ridge. To the mine," Gideon said. "Viola, I need you with me. We're going to bring his mountain down on his head." There was no time for arguments. They split up, melting into the darkness as the fire from the burning cabin cast long, dancing shadows. The plan was terrifyingly simple. Clarabelle and the others would be the bait. Gideon and Viola would be the weapon. The journey over the ridge was a nightmare. They scrambled over rocks and through thorny brush, the sounds of shouting and gunfire from the farm growing fainter behind them. Every shadow looked like one of Kane's men. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. They finally reached the crest of the ridge and looked down. The mine was a scar on the landscape, a sprawling complex of buildings and machinery, all dark and seemingly deserted. A few lanterns burned near the main entrance, but Gideon's gamble had been right. Kane's forces were focused on the farm. Finding the entrance to the abandoned western tunnel took nearly an hour of desperate searching. It was little more than a crack in the rock face, hidden behind a tangle of overgrown bushes. The entrance boarded up with rotting planks. "This is it," Gideon whispered, prying the boards loose. A gust of cold, stale air rushed out, smelling of damp earth and forgotten things. They lit a lantern, its feeble glow pushing back against a century of darkness. The tunnel was narrow, the walls slick with moisture. Wooden support beams, furry with mold, groaned under the immense weight of the rock above them. It felt like walking into the belly of a dead beast. Following Sarah's map, they navigated the labyrinthine passages. Twice they had to crawl through partial collapses. The air grew thin and cold. Finally, they reached the spot marked on the map, directly below Kane's office. And there it was, just as Sarah had written, a massive central support beam, the main pillar holding up the entire section of the mine. And running down the center of it was a deep, jagged crack. "Sarah was right," Viola breathed, her voice filled with awe. "It's not enough to break it," Gideon said, running his hand over the cracked wood. "We need to bring it all down. We need to create a chain reaction." He looked around the tunnel. It was being used for storage, just as Sarah had noted. Crates of blasting powder and dynamite, meant for expanding the mine, were stacked carelessly against the walls. A new, even more audacious plan bloomed in Gideon's mind. "We're not just going to collapse the office," he said, a grim smile on his face. "We're going to blow this whole rotten mountain sky high." They worked frantically, piling crates of dynamite around the cracked support beam and two other key structural points in the tunnel. Viola, it turned out, knew a thing or two about explosives from her mysterious past. She expertly laid out fuses, connecting the charges together. "This will be enough to bring down half the mountain," she said, her work finished. "When this goes, Kane's entire operation goes with it." They lit the long main fuse, its slow, steady sizzle counting down the seconds to destruction. Then they ran. They scrambled back through the tunnels, their hearts pounding in their chests, the hiss of the fuse chasing them through the darkness. They burst out of the tunnel entrance, gasping for fresh air, just as the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the path below. It was Kane, and he wasn't alone. The diversion must have failed. He was riding back with half a dozen of his men, a look of triumph on his face. He must have realized the cabin was empty and that they'd been tricked. He saw them, his face illuminated by the lantern light, twisted from triumph to pure, murderous rage. "There you are," he roared, drawing his pistol. "You can't escape." He raised his gun to fire. Gideon pushed Viola behind a rock, raising his own rifle. This was it, the final standoff. But before anyone could pull a trigger, the ground began to tremble. A low, deep rumble started from within the mountain, growing louder and louder. The birds in the trees took flight, screeching into the night. Kane looked around, confused. His men's horses began to rear up, panicked. And then the mountain exploded. It wasn't just one explosion. It was a series of them, a rolling wave of thunder that ripped through the rock. The ground beneath their feet bucked like a living thing. The entire face of the mine complex, where Kane's office and headquarters stood, seemed to bulge outward and then disintegrate into an avalanche of rock and dust and fire. The shock wave hit them like a physical blow, knocking them off their feet. Kane and his men were thrown from their horses. The roar was deafening, a sound of pure elemental destruction. When the dust began to settle, there was nothing left. Kane's empire, his wealth, his power, all of it was buried under thousands of tons of rock. The silver mine was gone. Kane pushed himself to his feet, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. His men were scattered, injured, their will to fight broken. He was alone. He looked at Gideon, his eyes filled with a hatred that was almost pure insanity. You ruined me," he screamed, his voice hoarse. "You murdered my sister," Gideon said, his voice cold and steady as he walked toward Kane, his rifle aimed. "You preyed on the weak. You destroyed families. This isn't ruin. This is justice. Cain, in a final desperate act of rage, lunged at him. But he was no match for Gideon's cold fury. Gideon sidestepped and brought the rifle butt down hard on the back of Cain's head. The big man crumpled to the ground unconscious. The war was over. As dawn broke, casting a pale, clean light over the ravaged landscape, the territorial marshal finally arrived. Not Barlow, but a true federal marshal, alerted by a message Clarabelle had managed to get to a neighboring county. He'd arrived to find Cain's men surrendering and Cain himself tied up and waiting. The papers, Sarah's legacy, were handed over, and the full story came out. The marshal looked at the devastation, at the bundle of evidence, and then at the small group of exhausted but unbroken women. It seemed, he said with a grim nod of respect, that justice was served here before I even arrived. They returned to the farm. The cabin was a smoldering ruin. The barn was a pile of ash. Everything Gideon had built in his solitude was gone. But as he looked around at his family, at Clarabelle and Viola and Mercy and the others, he realized he hadn't lost a thing. They had lost their homes, their pasts, their loved ones. But they had survived. Together. In the weeks and months that followed, they rebuilt. They used what little money they had, and with the help of the other families who were now free from Cain's tyranny, they built a new, larger house on the ashes of the old one. They planted new crops. They bought new cows. Gideon Marsh was no longer a ghost. He was a brother, an uncle, a leader. He was the man Sarah had always believed him to be. One evening, as he stood on the porch of their new home, watching Mercy teach one of the younger women how to properly milk a cow, he felt a sense of peace he had never thought he would feel again. The silence was gone, replaced by the sound of laughter. And it was the most beautiful sound in the world. He had found his family, or maybe they had found him, and in doing so, they had all found their way home. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, and you want to hear more tales where the underdog rises up and fights back, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to ring the notification bell so you don't miss a single story. Every single subscription helps us keep this channel going and bring these stories to life. Let me know in the comments what you thought of Gideon's final plan. Until next time, stay safe and always stand up for what's right.